ناي بحقي نحاد ملوء زمن ترقصنا كساب شحنت شعات مئتين أربعان حدن نحمس عمتات تحت مجزأتي إيطاليا أبجزء مريتنا قوانوتن تحت سبن كوينا أحلفنا يو دهر خالقاي كوينا تعلم نعسرتتات عمتات مثلنا نرأس وسانين ناصنتن كنركب زقباء أب تحت مجزأة إنجليز ካብ ናጽነትና ተቆሊፍና መሪር ናይ ፖለቲካዊ ውዲትን ሽበራን ዕንወትን እዋን ሓሊፍና ኣብ ትሕቲ ድሑራት ገዛእቲ ኢትዮጵያ ብባርነት ክንቁረን ተበይኑልና ኣይተንበርከኽናን ክሳብ ብረታዊ ቃልሲ ዝጅመር حزبنا بيوه امنت بوليتيكاو مسلاتو بسلاماو منقدن من رقاقات ابا حمساتات زرعيو تقاومون نمحبر سب عالم كسمعوز فتنة اوياتن بعات افا مقرفتن شبران سرعات هايلة سلاسية بتحدوغن محبر سب عالم نساوعيت حزب إرترا بذا استحقرون بتخالي حزب إرترا بأوانو مسؤولون سلامن كالرقاقص عدل أي رخبا حزب إرترا جن أي تحللن بعات أفا مقرفتن سكياتن كونه نا عالم مستحقار مسلاتون من رقاقص كالا أمارات إتات سلزة تعاطوه تبنجا غلعل تقديدو ناب عدقاو غالسو أمئتاو نسالاس عمتات بزي مسلكاي مداركت زي بلو قارسي أكايدو حارنتو خمزي جبت كوينيو
Number one, Eritrea did not get its independence from Ethiopia at all. I mean, we had our just cause, we fought for a long time, for almost 3 decades, probably half a century. And when 91 came, we said, we're postponing the unilateral declaration of independence to go through a legitimate political process to assure the international community and be assured that we have exercised this right through a referendum. Then people were saying, well, a referendum could be expedited if the Ethiopian government agrees to the referendum process. We said, no, not at all. We are not asking for the blessing of the Ethiopian government or anybody else for that matter. We would like to exercise this right through a referendum, and we would like the international community to come help us organize and witness the desire or the wish of our population. No one was invited to offer Eritrea independence in a silver platter, not at all. We rejected that all the way.
Q. You had a program in Eritrea at that time. Kleiner. Yes, we had a small mission headquartered in Asmara. Not long after I got to Ethiopia, I took a trip to Asmara. Our representative there, Charlie Campbell, just the week before I arrived, had been fired on by rebels who were already active. This goes back to 1957. They were already out in the hinterland and creating problems for the central government. It wasn't totally secure, even back then. Q. Why did we have a program there? Kleiner. The decision was made before I arrived and was related to the presence of Kagnew Station. Thomas P. Melady FAO, USAID Ethiopia, 1954-1956, Ambassador Thomas P. Melady was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1927. He served in the U.S. Army and received his B.A. from Duquesne University in 1950. He received his M.A. and Ph.D. from the Catholic University of America in 1952 and 1954. His career included positions in Ethiopia, Burundi, Uganda, and the Vatican. He was interviewed by Charles Stewart Kennedy on January 13 and 19, 1995. Melady, and I ended up in Ethiopia. Q. This was from when to when? Melady, I was in Ethiopia. I started with FOA approximately in the fall of 1954, having gotten my degree in the summer and spending the rest of the summer in polishing off the dissertation. And I was with FOA for about 2 years, mostly in Ethiopia, or getting ready for it or coming back. And I became fascinated by Africa. Ethiopia is a very special cup of tea in regard to Africa. It was then especially in the time of Emperor Haile Selassie. And it was really there that I said to myself, I really ought to have an area specialty. I became fascinated with the emperor because one of my students, I also taught part-time there at the university, and one of my students was a nephew of His Majesty, and I arranged to interview him. And to make a long story short, I returned after 2 years, and joined the staff of Duquesne University in Pittsburgh where I, among other things, set up the Institute of African Studies. I'd like to make the long story longer. I'd like to return to Ethiopia. Here you were a young man in Ethiopia, how did you see Ethiopia in those days? Melady, well, it's mountainous kingdom, a very special face of Africa, in the continent of Africa, impacted by the Middle East, one of the ancient Christian lands, at least the northeastern part was, a monarchy with an emperor who was a world figure going back to the League of Nations who fought the fascists, etc. A fascinating country. His predecessor, Emperor Menelik and Queen Zewditu both gave a welcome to refugees. For example, there was a large Armenian community, people who had fled there and were given refuge after the Turkish problems of 1917. You had a Greek community. The emperor himself welcomed specialists and teachers, engineers, etc. from Eastern Europe. And you had a Polish community, rather small communities. I was fascinated by this mosaic of culture in Addis, and also Ethiopia itself. I remember I went down to Dire Dawa, and I had heard there were black Jews in Ethiopia, and I went down and explored them near the Falashes, and one of my first published articles, entitled The Black Jews, and I interviewed them. It was a scholarly article. While there I became fascinated by the role of the emperor who I felt then, and still do, and I said this later in a book, but in my first article he had this plan for evolutionary change. He was an authoritarian. He was the classical believer in Plato's republic ruled by the elite. He was quite authoritarian but not a tyrant, there's a difference. And I thought it was appropriate at the time, and just before leaving Ethiopia I remember I wrote an article, I had a contact, a friend of mine was on, for a magazine in the United States of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And soon after I was back in the United States, Macmillan publisher called me, and it was an editor, and he said, I've just read your article on the emperor. The article took the man and described the man against the country, so it was about Ethiopia and how he was the natural product of Ethiopia. And he said, given the interest in Africa, I think we'd like to come up with a book which would be on 10 to 12 of the African leaders, with the same writing style, the man, the country, the culture. So to make a long story short, I said I'd like to do it. So between 57 and 60, between setting up the Institute of African Affairs, and doing other things at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, I made some trips to Africa and met the then African leaders in countries that were just emerging into independence, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Leopold Senghor in Senegal, Houphouët Boigny who is now deceased in Ivory Coast. I got over to the East African coast, Tom Mboya, and Julius Nyerere. They were leaders then struggling for independence, with the exception then of Ghana who had already achieved it. But I did the research in the period of really, 57, 58, 59. By 59 many nations in Africa were on the road to independence. I remember I enjoyed doing it, and got down to the then Congo, Kinshasa. Stopped at Togo and met Sylvanus Olympio who later was assassinated. All these people were in my book, and the book was sort of a hobby because I had a full-time job. But it enriched my fundamental knowledge of Africa and the whole movement towards independence. The book came out and I was very fortunate. I've written 12 books, but probably that did the best of them all, mostly because of timing. It came out in 1960 and I remember it was prominently reviewed by the New York Times. And that sort of confirmed my interest in Africa, and you might say it gave me an extra credential. I want to go back to Ethiopia and then come back to the book. In Ethiopia, what was your job with aid or FAO? Melady, FAO, the administration of President Eisenhower, and we had a great emphasis on trade and investment, not aid. So it was an office known as the Office of Trade and Investment to identify trade opportunities, and investment opportunities. Our goal was to pick a favorable investment climate, avoiding some double taxation and other measures to attract foreign capital. and other measures to attract good trade relations. And one of the things that we suggested was a trade fair. I remember it was a lot of fun working on. Looking at these leaders, I recall at the time there was sort of a glow in the United States. This was just before the Kennedy administration came in, but people were looking with great enthusiasm on Africa. Melady, that's right, in the whole of the 60s, but particularly the early 60s. Were you seeing something different with these leaders than actually developed? So much has sort of turned to ashes in some of those areas. Melady, again the leaders reflected a background in culture, dealing with Leopold Senghor, a man of great culture, now a member of the French Academy. In fact, that was the title of a chapter, Leopold Sedar Senghor, poet, philosopher, president. Hofo Boini, who was a MD, a medical doctor, the son of who would have been a king, or a chieftain. They were involved in the sweep of history. And the sweep of history was calling for independence. Now that was then. I certainly supported the whole concept. Remember, it was also a period of the Cold War. It wasn't a neutral period. Would the enthusiasm have been there if it had been a neutral period with no major confrontation? I'm not sure, but nonetheless, there was general support in American establishment circles that it was in the interest of the African people, and in the interest of the West to have a rapid evolution to independence. Rather than what had happened in Kenya of the major power fighting it, and having what was called Mau Mau, or not so well recorded in history, what the French did in Madagascar to put down the revolution of 1945-1946. It's a little hard to go back, but I think it's interesting since you were surveying the area at the time. What was the view of the role of the Soviets? Was this of concern on the academic side too or not? Melady, I'd say not so much in Ethiopia when I was there, but later in traveling when I would deal with just the leaders, have interviews with them, etc. It included Tubman in Liberia, by the way. I would stay a month or so in a given country at the policy level. There was no doubt that the Soviets were quite active. First of all, they made it public in terms of their proclamations. They felt at that time that it was ripe for revolution, the destruction of the old order, and the establishment of a new order. Therefore they were active in terms of spreading the doctrine, and in practical things like technical assistance reflecting their economic philosophy. And a very active student exchange program dramatized by the establishment of Lumumba University in Moscow. So scholars in the next century will evaluate it. There was no question that the Cold War confrontation played a major role in some of the good things like rapid movement to independence. And some of the more recent tragedies, of course, were in Angola and Mozambique. Hopefully the one in Mozambique is thoroughly over. Angola might be over. I mean, the Cold War was fought out in Angola and Mozambique. So how long were you running this institute? Melady, the book got published. I like writing books. I must say, from the standpoint of sales of all my books, that did the best of them all, and it encouraged me that I might be able to become a full-time writer. So I went to New York with that in mind, and I put together a package of where I had taught in a special arrangement, either having adjuncted 2 courses between Fordham University and St. John's University. St. John's University, later establishing an Institute of African Affairs. I wanted to teach and have the spare time that professors get. I also was part-time head of a Catholic-sponsored organization known as Africa Service Institute, tied into the Catholic Interracial Council, and I began writing books, and going off to Africa in the summer free from my academic duties. I decided the second book ought to be on Southern Africa, and wrote White Man's Future in Black Africa. The reviews were fairly good, but it didn't sell quite as well. I never sold enough books to make it a full-time activity, but I kept on writing. I did for Macmillan Faces of Africa, my third book, which turned out to be a supplementary textbook. Then I went on to write a book on the rise of the relationship between nationalism and racism, a book I'm rather proud of, and I was pleased to see it has been reprinted a couple of times. I remember Hawthorne did it, and I gave it the title, The Rise to Power of Non-White Peoples in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean. But they redid the title and called it The Revolution of Color. It did fairly well. I also did Western Policy and the Third World. I would write them in the course of the year. From June through August I'd be traveling. And I was in various civic committees. I was an active Republican. In those days I was a young Republican. One of the largest and most effective young Republican clubs in the country was in New York City, where I lived. And I was chair of the African subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and did think pieces and that kind of thing. It became apparent to me after my third book, Focus of Africa, was published by Macmillan that writing would have to be an extracurricular activity as the earnings were not sufficient to support a family. Stuart P. Lilico USIS Addis Ababa, 1955-1960, Stuart P. Lilico was born in Seattle, Washington in 1909. After graduating from the University of Washington, he joined the United States Information Agency in 1953. His career included positions in India, Ethiopia, Zanzibar, Rhodesia, and Japan. Mr. Lilico was interviewed by John Hogan in 1988. Q. Now, from New Delhi, you next went to Ethiopia. What do you remember about your tour in Ethiopia? Lilico, I remember Ethiopia as being the most nerve-wracking place I have ever served. I do not know just why that was. I found working with the Ethiopian government and people to be a source of a great deal of tension. I was not unhappy when I was transferred. In the meantime, we were doing on a smaller scale what we had done in India. We put out a daily news bulletin, the material for which was taken off the wireless file. We also picked up headlines from the morning VOA news. We put out, as I recall, up to 10 mimeograph pages, both sides, of news and commentary in English, plus a single sheet of translation into Amharic, the language of the ruling group at that time in Ethiopia. We had a rule of thumb that the people we were trying to reach were able to speak and read English. Those who did not speak English probably had very little influence on Ethiopian policy for lack of education. English was generally taught in primary schools. Of course, the vast majority of Ethiopians could not read any language. We followed that policy, fairly steadily, despite occasional efforts to get us off into something else. That seemed to be our best bet, all the way through. We had a circulation, as I recall, around 1200, mostly right in Addis Ababa itself, but we did send copies to other parts of the country by mail. We worked with the three principal newspapers in Addis Ababa. One was in French, run by an expatriate American. The second, in English, was run by a Canadian, and the third in Amharic. All were government organizations, but we had excellent relations with them, I am happy to say. In addition, USIS had a good library and we did have a scholarship program. It was a good operation, I think, in Addis Ababa. Howard Imbrey Attaché Addis Ababa, 1956-1958, Howard Imbrey was born in 1921 in New Jersey. He received his BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1942 and served in the U.S. Army during World War II. His career has included positions in India, Sri Lanka, the Congo, France, Belgium, and Italy. He was interviewed by Charles Stewart Kennedy on June 21, 2001. Q. And you were in Addis Ababa from when to when? Imbrey, 56 through 58. Q. What was the situation in Ethiopia at the time? Imbrey, life was never easy. The emperor was fully in charge. We liked him, and in our terms in our country he was pretty good. The revenue that he got from the people was under his care when almost 90% were educated, and so we had no quarrel with the emperor except the fact that he was always asking for more money and airplanes. Joe Simonson was the ambassador and was made ambassador because Eisenhower was under the impression that Ethiopia was a theocracy and that he should send a reverend. Simonson was a minister and he opened every meeting in the embassy, in the name of Jesus Christ, the elder brother of the human race, let not the emperor ask me again for a Constitution airplane. But, it was a Constellation airplane. He wanted desperately a Constellation airplane. Q. Oh, yes, beautiful planes. Imbrey, oh, I loved them. But, at any rate, it was a relatively calm and peaceful country. There were always sideline attempts by the military to get an advantage. Only one important one, and that occurred after I left. Q. What about Eritrea at that time? Imbrey, that was a thorny issue, and the reason for that was in 1954 the United Nations, in their wisdom or the wisdom of 4 delegates that they sent to map out the situation, decided that the Eritrea issue should be under the Ethiopians for military and foreign affairs, but otherwise have a certain amount of freedom. This never worked as far as the Ethiopians were concerned. Q. Well, while you were there, was Eritrea technically in a different status? Imbrey, yes, it was a province, but it was under its own leadership. It was a self-rule. Q. Did we have Kagnew Station at the time? IMBREY. Yes, indeed we had Kagnew Station, and we also had a camp there that contained enough beds, bedding and equipment to house all the people who might eventually be driven out of the Middle East in the event of a serious conflict. I forget the name of that camp, but I visited it a number of times. Q. It was all part of the evacuation system. During this time you were there, I was in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and that was kind of where our safe haven was. IMBREY. Oh, you were. But then if you were airlifted out of Tehran, then you were gone to Eritrea to this particular camp. Q. Yes. How about relations with Somalia at the time? IMBREY. At the time there were no relations. They got along, and I don't think there was any difficulty between the two countries to speak of. Q. They weren't having a war over the Ogaden. IMBREY. No, they weren't having a war. What was happening there all the time was tribal movements and disturbances at just about every time. Q. Well, there are nomads going back and forth across that Ogaden desert. Were you involved in the long-term question of who was going to succeed Haile Selassie? IMBREY. No, that was pretty well taken care of. He had 2 sons who were eligible. One of them was killed in an automobile crash while we were there. Then the Crown Prince was the obvious selection to be the ruler. We got along with the Crown Prince just fine. Q. So, were we messing around there? IMBREY. Oh, yes, we had operations, but there again they were against the Russians, against their acolytes. We had the first really important telephone operation. This was before that great thing in the tunnel in Berlin. We had a very big operation. As a matter of fact, we had bugs on the Soviets, Czechs, Egyptians, and I think a Bulgarian came in. I can't feel that it was a high priority. In the embassy there was a wing which was known by the locals as the CIA wing. In the basement we had many tape recorders, and a number of people spent the entire day translating from the various take on these things. We had a house rather far out in which the tape recorders were running night and day, causing a great deal of problems for us because we have to explain the high bill for electricity, which we did by getting somebody in the telephone company to ignore it. But then the problem was the heat that was generated by these things, and we had to go out and buy more fans all the time. The fans didn't work, the electricity didn't work, and everything didn't work, as you can imagine. Then another thing, we had a central place where the telephone lines were connected to our apparatus. This was about 4 feet underground, and we built in the house of a former agent. We built a garage around it to make it appear as if it were a garage, and then we buried this stuff. Well, about every 4 or 5 months they would decide to extend the telephone lines, which would mean we'd have to go there, unbury the lines, put them near the surface so that they would find them, but they wouldn't find our bugs, and to do that you have to get through Ethiopian mud which sticks like a word indistinct. It was a 6-hour job getting this stuff to the surface and then getting it back in until we all hated it, but it was a successful operation, except that the people never said anything much over the phone. Q. Looking at this, were the Soviets very successful in Ethiopia? IMBREY. No, they didn't have much success. They made friends, and I don't think they convinced anybody. There was no communist party. Q. Later in the 70s you had Haile Selassie overthrown and the Mengistu government came in. They were talking Marxist, but I think they were sort of homegrown, weren't they? They weren't Soviet agents particularly. IMBREY. The Soviets were playing their own game, and the Soviet game at that time was to get to the Red Sea. Now they had been to Somalia, which is on the Indian Ocean. All of a sudden they dropped Somalia totally and made friends with the Ethiopians. People, most journalists, will tell you that's when the Americans moved in on the Somalis to take up the slack with the departure of the Russians. That was totally untrue. We never got into Somalia because the president, despite the fact the Russians deserted, was still communist. Q. Was it Siad Barre? IMBREY. Yes, Siad Barre. Siad Barre said go to Valista, as heard communists didn't want anything to do with the Americans, and it was only years later that we had somewhat of an arrangement with his intelligence organization. But it didn't make any difference. Somalia was such a backwater that we were not about to spend lots of money doing anything with it. Q. Well, my understanding was our foreign policy was almost revolved around Kagnew Station and keeping Kagnew Station. IMBREY, yes, and then when that became a liability they moved it to Liberia, God bless them. Q. In 58 what was your rank, title? IMBREY, let's see I was a GS-15 at the time. Q. What were you calling yourself? IMBREY, attaché at the embassy. Attaché of what? You know we had this big problem between the two brothers, between the two Dulleses. That lasted after both had departed. They did not want us confused with the Foreign Service and so we were always registered as FSR, where everybody looked down the list and spotted us right away. Herman Kleiner Mission Director, USAID Addis Ababa, 1957-1959, Herman Kleiner was born on March 6, 1920 in New York, New York. He attended the State University of New York at Albany and then entered the military. Mr. Kleiner began his career in foreign service in 1949 when he joined the Marshall Plan mission to the Netherlands. He also served in Yugoslavia, Ethiopia, and Brazil. Mr. Kleiner was interviewed by W. Haven North in 1996. Kleiner, when the mission director in Ethiopia resigned, I was asked if I would be interested. Q. This would be probably 1957 under the International Cooperation Administration, ICA. Kleiner, 1957. I arrived in Ethiopia in August of 57. Q. Why would you have accepted a switch from European programs out to Ethiopia of all places, comparatively? Kleiner, well, the European programs were on the way out, but there was still a good deal going on. I wasn't looking to go anywhere. I forget how it was brought to my attention, but Stuart Van Dyke, I'm sure, was involved. I was asked would I be interested and I said, sure. We ran into some trouble when my name was proposed to the ambassador, Don Bliss. His objection was that I was too young, that the Ethiopians respected age. He therefore made his view known that he'd prefer to have an older, more mature type. And I was fortunate in that Joe Palmer was then the Assistant Secretary of State, in effect Ambassador Bliss's boss, Q, for Africa. Kleiner. For Africa. I had worked with him on a negotiating team having to do with Libya, when we went to London for the negotiation with the British. And he spoke up, Q, what were you doing about Libya? Kleiner, it had to do with some sort of assistance program to help buoy up our ability to maintain the then considered very important US Wheeler Air Base in Libya. That was the only time I had any real direct contact with him, which lasted about a week. He spoke up and sort of told Don Bliss to back off, so I went out to Ethiopia. That was a memorable trip. In those days, as you recall, they didn't have any 4-engine planes flying to Ethiopia. To get to Ethiopia, you had to get up around midnight, go out to the airport in Athens, and you got into a 2-engine plane, I think it was called a Con. Q. Convair. Kleiner, Convair. And you'd fly initially to Egypt, Cairo, and then Q. Wadi Halfa. Kleiner, and then Khartoum, and then to Asmara, and finally to Addis Ababa. I remember my arrival at the airport. It was a beautiful day, as most days were in Addis, and in most of Ethiopia. And at the airport was Charlie Stokes, was the deputy director and his wife, and the agricultural officer, Molahan, and Dr. Curtis, who was the public health advisor, and others. At the mission, we were having a lot of personnel turnover. Charlie Stokes, who had been detailed from state, was scheduled to leave, and so was our program officer, Haven North. Also the program there had some special problems, the consequence of the Richards mission, which had made its swath through the Middle East and Ethiopia not long before I arrived. And what was the Richards mission? Richards was a recently retired congressman who had been chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Congress for many, many years. And he was asked to have a mission to visit the Middle Eastern countries as Q. By Eisenhower. Kleiner. By Eisenhower. His activity was part of the Eisenhower Doctrine, designed to build up relations with these countries. Giving gifts was considered to be a way to do that. Q. This was presumably to contain Soviet influence. Kleiner. Everything during that period and for many years thereafter was motivated to contain the Soviet influence. And we learned, at least I hope we learned, a lot of lessons about whether or not one can buy friendship. But at the time, it was good pickings for these governments visited. There were wild stories that came out at the time. In Yemen, for example, the imam in charge was suffering advanced stages of senility and illness. He thought that Americans were coming with bags of money. And that's all he wanted, money. He didn't get it. In Ethiopia, a program was put together that amounted to about $5 million. One element of it was to partially pay for a 4-engine plane, the first such to become part of the Ethiopian Airlines. I remember when that arrived. There was a big ceremony. It was all handled under contract with TWA, which provided a team of experts who helped train the Ethiopians to run and maintain an airline. That was a successful project. There were other projects financed by the Richards program, such as the Blue Nile Valley project, and they had not moved very far by the time I arrived. Q. Separate from technical assistance. Kleiner, yes, separate from the technical assistance program which had been going on for a number of years. The program was designed to build up the important institutions in Ethiopia, such as in education, public health, agriculture. Traditional, but slow, long-term programs, which I thought throughout the period were doing quite well, considering the problems of selecting participants, and selecting of personnel, etc. Ambassador Don Bliss was there for most of the time that I was there. We got along very well. Not too long after I arrived, we had a visit from Skinny Holmgren, who was the Chief Agricultural Officer in Washington. And I enjoyed his visit and subsequent visits from Washington. It was an opportunity to get news from what's going on in Washington, as we were rather remote in Ethiopia. Not long after that, Ralph Fisher came as Haven North's replacement. And then we got Carl Mathieson, with whom I had worked on Yugoslavia, who came as Assistant Program Officer, and Jim Rausch also came as Assistant Program Officer. Not too much later we had got a new director back in Washington, a fellow named Jimmy Smith, James Smith. Q. Administrator of ECA. Kleiner, ECA. I had been appointed by Mr. Hollister. He had succeeded Stassen. Jimmy Smith replaced Hollister. Jimmy Smith was a businessman. He had been the head of the Flying Tigers airline. He was a very closed-mouthed fellow, didn't speak much. People were afraid of him. When we were told he was coming out, we prepared an extensive program for him, trips to see our projects in Jimma and Alamaya and Gondar, meetings with the emperor and other officials, as well as receptions. And we tried to keep him busy. He didn't say much, all through his visit. Finally we got him to his plane. He'd arrived on his own plane. When he boarded, all he said to me was, "Good luck, Kleiner," and off he went. I had no ideas what his views would be, etc. Then I was tremendously surprised when not long after that I learned that he nominated me for the Fleming Award, the agency's nominee for 10 most outstanding men in government. Q. Interesting. Kleiner, that was the only way I learned what his impressions were. I enjoyed living and working in Ethiopia a great deal. The country was beautiful and varied. There was a mix of old cultures. The small European establishment, made up primarily of businessmen, lived a more or less separate life, as did the diplomatic community. The peoples of Ethiopia were made up of dozens of tribes, 40 different languages. It was the emperor's political and military skill that kept the country together as long as it did. Except for some limited rebel activity in the north, it was very tranquil during the period when I was there. Q. Did you meet the emperor? Kleiner, yes, I met him a number of times. It was an experience each time. He maintained a very formal court, at least as viewed by Westerners. Whenever Westerners would call on him, they had to wear mourning coat. Before I went out to Ethiopia, I was told to get that I should bring a mourning coat ensemble, white tie outfit, a white tuxedo jacket and a regular black tuxedo. I brought it all and I used it all. During each visit at the palace, the emperor was always seated on a slightly elevated platform on a gilt throne-like chair. A small man, petite almost, he held himself, seated or standing, very erect, very regal. Having been an emperor for so long, I guess he thought he was an emperor by the grace of God. You'd never see him take a hurried step, he always moved in a slow-moving, regal manner. We were taught that when you go in to meet him, you face him and bow halfway into the room. You would take your seat when he motioned you to do so. When you left, you would never turn your back on him. You would back out and bow as you left the reception hall. He never spoke directly to you in English, but always Amharic through his official interpreter. But he knew exactly what you were saying because he was fluent in English. I spoke in English which was translated into Amharic. He used it as a technique to permit himself more time to decide what he wanted to say. Q. What did you talk about? Kleiner, from time to time, there were problems in operations that seemed to remain unresolved through the normal channels. I would consult with the ambassador, keep him up to date on where we stood on programs and problems. When we decided that it was the time to resolve the obstacles in this or that program at the emperor's level, we would decide to seek an interview with him. All such meetings or interviews were arranged by the ambassador. He would be present at the sessions, too. Q. Do you remember what kind of problems you would take to him? Kleiner. I'm trying to think whether it related to actions such as personnel or financial contributions that we expected from the Ethiopians for certain programs. As a matter of policy, we expected some contribution by the Ethiopians in connection with each project we undertook. For normal operations, we had a central contact point in the government. It was run by an Ethiopian businessman who had been designated by the emperor. Q. Tekla, something like that. Kleiner. I can picture him, a fine-looking man. He'd come in from business. Another key contact was the Minister of Finance, Makonnen Habtewold. And he was a tall, very thin man and was quite old. I found him to be extremely useful and supportive. He was good in dealing with problems. We developed a good rapport. I enjoyed visiting our projects in the field. There was the agricultural high school at Jimma, which was run by a team we had under contract from Central Oklahoma A&M, which became Oklahoma State University. They developed and ran that program, the Agricultural Research Program and the Agricultural College at Alamaya. They were, I believe, very well run. The objective for these programs, as it was for all projects, was, ultimately, to turn them over to the Ethiopians in totality. There was always a battle with the Oklahoma people as how long that phase out would take. And we were pushing for earlier periods and they were less optimistic. They had developed a whole coterie of people that were working on that project. One of the continuing problems with institutional contractors such as universities was what part of their regular staff would they use and what part would they hire from the staff outside. Our interest was to maximize the use of regular staff. We didn't want to create a foreign service of the university. We wanted their regular staff, for several reasons. We knew that they were people that were likely to be well regarded by the institution itself, and would be less anxious to stretch the work out as long as they possibly could, for they had jobs to return to. It was a continuing bone of contention which endured, but it wasn't too serious a problem when I was there as the projects were still in the relatively early stages. When I was back in Washington years later, working on African problems, I kept pushing for phasing down and out, and we had battles with the Oklahoma people. Oklahoma had particular political clout because it was one of the oldest of the universities associated with the assistance program, starting with the Point 4 program. Also Dr. Bennett, who was an early president of the university, had himself participated in the start of the program. His was a powerful name in Washington, in the administration and on the Hill in Congress. Q. He was first head of TCA. Kleiner. TCA, the Point 4 program. So dealings with Oklahoma people took a lot of patience. They took advantage, I think, of their situation. But, in general, I thought, and still think, they did a good job. Q. What stood out as sort of one of the project that you found most interesting? Kleiner. The Gonda project in public health, which was located up north. For the project, we trained paramedical teams to work in the rural areas of the country. The training was conducted at the Gonda location by U.S. Public Health Service doctors and nurses. We trained the Ethiopians to work as teams. Q. Well, it was a team of 3. One was the health officer, one a nurse, and one a sanitarian. And I think that the training for the health officer was 3 years and for the nurse 2 years and the sanitarian 1 year, I think, something like that. Kleiner. I was very impressed with the enthusiasm of these young people. It was a tremendous opportunity for these young Ethiopians and the project had great promise. I don't know what happened later because of the bloody political upheaval that came after the emperor was deposed. While we're on that, I get a lot of pleasure from news that I receive from Oklahoma State University. They have formed an association of alumni which has ties with Ethiopia, Alamaya in particular. They publish a newsletter and have been holding annual meetings. I enjoy reading in the newsletters about the Ethiopians that have come back, and the fact that Alamaya still exists as a college-level agricultural institution. They send books and occasionally people go out to visit and help. Q. One interesting little sideline in connection is that, your two connections. 1. You worked on Hungarian refugees and some of those refugees were medical staff at Gondar. Kleiner, is that so? Q. They were brought to Ethiopia by the Ethiopian government and refugee organizations and worked as part of that staff under Dr. Curtis. Kleiner, that's interesting. Q. You had a little story about that. Kleiner, I forget just how we, as a mission, related to the Minister of the Interior. Oh yes, we had a public safety program to help professionalize the civil police forces. Q. Part of the $5 million grant. Kleiner, that was part of the $5 million Richards grant. And we had an expert, I forget the name of the gentleman, to help administer the program. Q. Colonel somebody. I don't remember it now. Kleiner, it was Colonel Selby. In connection with the program, we had contacts with the Minister of Interior, who was an important man in the group around the president running the country. At one point a young man, a young Ethiopian, shows up, escorted by an aide of the minister to my office at the mission. He made known to me that the young man was a gift to me from the minister in gratitude for what our program was accomplishing. Q. Minister of Interior. Kleiner, yes, the Minister of Interior. The question for me was, what was I supposed to do with him? He was given to me to do whatever I wanted. I would guess he was 15 or 16, tall and slim, bright, and without any knowledge of English. I conferred with the ambassador. Also, we were supposed to notify Washington when presented with gifts from foreign governments. The solution I chose was to give him a job. We employed him as the lowest entry-level laborer in the mission motor pool and trained him to work around cars, etc. The minister was thanked for his generosity and Washington informed of the gift and the disposition. The minister stressed the importance of handling the matter with delicacy. That was clear, but how? Another interesting development occurred in late 1958 or early 1959, when a cable arrives from Washington from Dr. Fitzgerald. Q. He was the deputy head of ECA at that time. Kleiner, he was the deputy of ECA and was the actual head of the agency. He directed me to go to Yemen to assess the impact of a famine that had then gripped Yemen and, I think, some surrounding countries. I was to make recommendations for USAID based on my findings. Yemen had no relations whatsoever with the US. I referred earlier to that crazy visit of the Richards mission to Yemen. Nothing came of it because the Imam was out of his mind. Hence, we had no embassy or other representation in the country. Apparently, a feeler had come out, asking if the US could provide assistance in dealing with the famine. The US government decided to consider the request and Dr. Fitzgerald decided that I should be the one to conduct the assessment. I requested Bill Carter, who was the mission controller, to accompany me. I had a special problem as my passport showed my religion as Jewish and Yemen might not allow entry of anyone of the Jewish faith. I was concerned that Dr. Fitzgerald hadn't thought of that as being a possible problem in my getting into the country. There was a regular weekly flight from Ethiopia to Yemen. That would have been the usual route to get in there. But, concerned about this problem and believing it likely the tightest restrictions would be at the airport, we decided to go in through neighboring Aden, which was then still under British control. We had the US consul in Aden. Consequently, we flew to Aden. The consul who had visited Yemen periodically arranged to advise Yemeni authorities that we were arriving from Aden at roughly a certain time. So we went in overland by jeep to Yemen. Q. The US consul with you. Kleiner, the US consul was with me, and Bill Carter. That was an experience. It was high plateau. We passed through villages that were just right out of ancient history, the people were just living in little huts. This open land was actually less flat than I thought it might be. Finally, we got to Taiz. It was the main city, though not the official capital, which was Sana'a. It was architecturally striking. It had buildings of multiple floors, but all built out of mud. We were put up in a guest house, the Imam's official guest house. There was no restaurant, no place to eat. Staff would come to the corridor outside your room and prepare your food on little hot grills, fires, and they'd give you the food. But we were there for several days taking trips to see what was going on. Q. Was somebody in the government with you? Kleiner, a government official was with us. We talked about what the food needs of the country and its availability, and he set up the necessary meetings with local representatives. We checked the port facilities and explored the kind of controls which would be placed on food that might be imported. We worked on the preliminary arrangements. Ultimately, a program was initiated based on our recommendations. That was the beginning of the US presence in Yemen. I don't know what the situation is now. I believe the US still has a presence there. Q. Yes. Interesting. That was really the beginning of our program in Yemen, and there was no embassy, so it was the first contact of any consequence. Did somebody go there to stay and distribute the food? Kleiner. Yes. There was a small, very small mission. While living in Ethiopia, we used to occasionally for R&R, go down to Nairobi in Kenya. It was a delightful place to visit. It was developed by the British, who knew how to take care of themselves. It was quite different from Ethiopia. Q. Did you have any contact with the British in Addis Ababa? Kleiner. Yes. There was a British embassy. I don't think they had an aid program. There were British and French cultural programs, and the Israelis were beginning a small technical assistance program, but we were the only significant bilateral program. There was a UN program. Interestingly, the Ethiopians at that time did not consider themselves as being African. They would say that they were red. The emperor's political, economic and cultural outlook was oriented toward Europe. And it was only later, when he began to aspire to a position of leadership in the newly developing and independent Africa, that he made state visits to African countries and sought to retain a leadership role in Africa. He succeeded in getting the Organization of African States, OAS, to establish its headquarters in Addis Ababa. And it was an interesting change. Another thing we started to observe was the growing pressure from the Soviet Union to get a foothold in Ethiopia. The US maintained for a long time an important military communications center, Kagnu Station, in Eritrea, Asmara. Toward the end of my stay there, at a meeting we had with the emperor, he informed us that he had been offered military assistance in the form of supplies and equipment and training from the Soviet Union, and he was exploring whether we would do the same. We were rather courageous in deciding not to seek to outbid the Soviets in military assistance, and, after consulting Washington, the emperor was so informed. Later there was a Soviet presence. Q. While you were there, you were aware of their presence. Kleiner. They started coming later. Q. This was military presence. Kleiner. Military assistance, yes, as well as economic and technical assistance, particularly after the emperor was deposed. The Soviet bloc made little inroad while the emperor was in power. Q. So the Richards mission didn't work. Kleiner. Number. Because there is no end to how much you have to give, if you seek long-term influence by buying it. You have to keep buying and lend yourself to blackmail. The competition becomes pretty steep. Let me cite an example: the railway link between Tanzania and Zambia. Q. Tanzam Railroad. Kleiner. Yes, Tanzam Railroad. And I had a run-in with Averell Harriman on that. We'll talk about that. Q. Talk about that later. Kleiner. Okay. Q. Well, what's your overall impression of what we were accomplishing in Ethiopia? Kleiner. My impression was that the program establishing and building institutions was good. To help these new institutions develop from the ground up, we provided the experts to begin operations while we were training Ethiopians to come back and replace our people. The whole thing was designed to permit a turnover from US to Ethiopian management and control. What we didn't understand and couldn't foresee is that, even if we were successful, we were establishing claims on Ethiopian resources for the maintenance of these things ad infinitum. We assumed they would figure into the priorities of successor regimes because they were rather humble initiatives. We're talking about a country of 40 million people, as I recall. So they needed basic processes and initiatives. What more could they need than public health, agriculture? They had a rich promise of agriculture. Certainly they needed education to bring their people into the 20th century. We couldn't foresee the takeover by radical military leftists who just destroyed practically everything that had been done. It was tragic that the emperor's regime was terminated as it was. It was always a question whether the emperor was loosening his controls fast enough to avoid severe political strain after he left the scene. The first attempt to overthrow the emperor failed. It must have been in 1963. I was assigned then in New York at the U.S. mission to the UN, and the emperor came to New York to address the UN General Assembly. I saw him there and we greeted each other. From there he flew down to Brazil and, while there, learned that there had been a palace coup with his son among the coup leaders. He cut short his state visit to Brazil, got on his plane and went back. On his arrival, the coup collapsed and he reassumed leadership. Whether his son was a willing part of the plot, we don't know. Not too long after that, he was overthrown, imprisoned in his own palace and never survived. Q. What did you think about the people that we had trained, the Ethiopians? What did you experience with those who had completed their training? Kleiner. Many hundreds were trained in the various facilities we had established in the fields of agriculture, education and public health. Many received advanced education and training in the US through our participant program. Many of them ultimately found their way into the States after the military takeover and did very well here. The UN and the IBRD hired quite a few relative to the others from developing countries. Occasionally I bumped into some that we had trained and who had left. Incidentally, as you probably know, there are a large number of Ethiopian restaurants in Washington. Washington became a center for Ethiopians who had exiled themselves or who had been exiled. The interruption by the communist military regime set back economic development for many years. Also unhelpful were the problems up in Eritrea. Eritrea was part of. Q. You had a program in Eritrea at that time. Kleiner. Yes, we had a small mission headquartered in Asmara. Not long after I got to Ethiopia, I took a trip to Asmara. Our representative there, Charlie Campbell, just the week before I arrived, had been fired on by rebels who were already active. This goes back to 1957. They were already out in the hinterland and creating problems for the central government. It wasn't totally secure, even back then. Q. Why did we have a program there? Kleiner. The decision was made before I arrived and was related to the presence of Kagnew Station. The country was large. Communications were difficult, transport was difficult. Our program consisted of a nursery school, or vocational trade school, and participant training. Eritrea was an important agricultural center and had an important port in Massawa. It was a wild ride from Asmara to Massawa. It was on that route that Campbell was shot at. Separatist activity was brewing. There was the growing presence of the Muslims coming in from the north which fueled the struggle that developed with the Coptic and other groups to the south. It's now a separate country. Q. Right. Kleiner. Do we have a mission up there now? Q. Yes. Kleiner. It was a bitter and destructive war for many, many years. Q. Any question about relationships to the embassy at that time? You were mission director. Kleiner. Don Bliss was the ambassador the whole time I was there. We got along very well. It was a special satisfaction to me because, as I mentioned earlier, he had originally opposed my appointment. Ollie Troxell was the economic officer. He was a strong, independent-minded fellow. We got along well. There was a CIA presence there. In fact, one of the people lives in retirement right around the corner from where we are now. Q. Were there any issues about relationships or coordination? Of course, the office was some distance away so you had your own independence, I guess. Kleiner. Maybe the distance of time has blurred my recall of these things, but I don't remember any significant problems. The whole country-team relationship was harmonious. I made sure to keep lines of communication open to avoid surprises. One activity which was not work-related. The emperor had 4 or so children. His favorite son, the one he was grooming to succeed him, had been killed in an automobile accident. This occurred the year before I arrived. Q. The Duke of Hara. Kleiner. That's correct, the Duke of Hara. We in the mission thought of the idea of having a program dedicated to the late Duke of Hara. The proceeds of the ticket sales were donated to an Ethiopian charitable organization. The production we staged in the auditorium. It included music, dances, skits, etc. It was a gala event. The emperor and his coterie came, as did most of the diplomatic and business communities. The emperor was obviously very pleased. It was also a morale booster for the whole mission and embassy. Q. This was at the Opera House. Kleiner. Yes, it was at the Opera House. The fellow who had come, also, to carry out one of the Richard Mission projects in communications had a lot of experience in theatrical productions and he put it all together. It was really a great show. Q. Were there any particular program areas that you were trying to initiate or focus on? Kleiner. My main emphasis was in implementing that which we had already committed and undertaken. Even at that stage, felt that there was too much attention in the agency to new initiatives while old initiatives were lying around. I initiated a fairly rigorous system of follow-up, meeting regularly with the heads of the various units on each project, setting targets for specific time periods and trying to hold them accountable for progress. I also did a lot of site visits. When I arrived, the Richard Mission project commitments had been lagging. We wanted to get those well underway before seeking appropriations for new activities.
My name is Addis. I am the permanent representative of Eritrea to the United Nations. And I would like to say that the UN Security Council has today passed a shameful resolution imposing sanctions against Eritrea. But this is not their first time. From this building and the plenary General Assembly in 1950, the then Secretary of State of the United States, John Foster Dulles, stated that in the eyes of justice, Eritrea should have been given its independence. But because of our interest, we have decided to federate Eritrea with our ally, Ethiopia. And because of that time, of that action, that resolution, Eritrea suffered for 40 solid years. Eritreans fought for 30 solid years and came out victorious militarily. And they prevailed. And again today, the Security Council has decided to impose sanctions on Eritrea on fabricated lies, mainly concocted by the Ethiopian regime and the the US administration. As I said before, Eritreans haven't done anything. All these sanctions have no relevance. They were totally irrelevant with no concrete evidences. But it was through the pressure of the US mission that these sanctions have been passed. Most of the Security Council members, right from the first beginning, were really confused with the drafted resolution because it was a mixture of everything. But they feel that we felt that they have been, their hands have been twisted, and this is the situation. Go ahead.
share, like, subscribe ምግባር ኣይትረስዑ. Thank you.